Question. Pray the gay away. We see some religious people condemning homosexuality because the Bible, Quran, etc. says so. In addition, they back it up by bringing Leviticus into the equation that a man should not lay with another man. It is an abomination, referring to the old tale of Sodom and Gomorrah when God supposedly destroyed the city because of the vile and filthy lifestyle they were committing. What happened? The story of Lot and his wife who turned into a pillar of salt. Furthermore, we see testimonials of former gays who gave their lives to Christ, repented, and now are free of homosexuality. If it is not wrong to be gay, why do some of them, when they repent, turn straight, saying it was demons that convinced them to be gay? Does that mean we are not supposed to be homosexuals and it is against nature, and those who are are confused and need to be healed? And in some cases, when we see testimonials on YouTube, it can happen through Christ. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Okay, so this is one of these questions that makes me wonder whether the human race has a future or whether it's destined to self-destruct. Because it's always been clear to me that progress is based on having an open mind and being open to new ideas and new ways of looking at things. And this topic demonstrates to me how many people have completely closed minds. So I don't really expect that I can say anything here that will that will even be accepted by most people who are interested in this topic. But anyway, I'll make a few remarks. When I look at any topic, I always try to step back and look at it from a wider perspective and look for any kind of inconsistencies. So the first thing that comes to mind here is, so you have a person who grew up in a Christian environment and sees himself as a Christian. But he also had homosexual tendencies. So he now prays to Jesus and he believes that Jesus took his homosexuality away and now he's recovered. But what I don't see is people asking the question, if Jesus took your homosexuality away, who gave it to you? Because if you are a Christian, like the many Christians I knew in the United States, or met in the United States, you don't believe in reincarnation. So you came into being at the beginning of this lifetime. And God created you, because God is the Almighty Creator who created everything. So if you have gay tendencies, who gave them to you except God? And so here you are saying, God gave me homosexuality, but I prayed to Jesus and Jesus took it away. But wait a minute, you're a Christian, right? So you believe in the Nicene Creed, or at least you haven't distanced yourself from the Nicene Creed if you are a fundamentalist Christian. So Jesus is God. So you're saying one part of God gave you homosexuality, the other part of God took it away. Is God a house divided against itself? All I'm trying to point out here, I know there are all kinds of arguments they'll come up with. I'm just trying to point out there's something here that people aren't thinking about. But now there's another thing. Obviously, the question to ask is, why do so many people who grew up in a Christian environment believe that homosexuality is wrong or sin, and that it's a flaw that should be cured? Well, again, as the questioner points out, it's because they refer to the Old Testament. But they're Christians, right? They're not Old Testament people. So is it really possible that these supposed Christians who claim that they know the Bible, they have read the Bible, is it really possible they haven't realized that there is a fundamental, I would even say an irreconcilable difference between the image of God portrayed in the Old Testament and the view of God given by Jesus? Have they really not seen that the Old Testament God is the angry and judgmental man in the sky, and Jesus' God is the loving Father figure? Have they really not read the parable about the Good Samaritan? Have they really not grasped what it's about? Because the idea is there was a man who was laying by the wayside, and the self-righteous people walked by him, But a Samaritan, which was despised by the self-righteous people, helped the man. In today's age, who are the self-righteous people? Well, in America and many other nations, they are Christians. So they are likely to walk by the man lying at the wayside, and who is the Samaritan that might help him? Well, it could very well be a gay person, because the people who have experienced growing up being put down by the self-righteous people are more tolerant and likely to help others. But didn't Jesus give this parable in order to say you should be more like the Samaritan than the self-righteous people, and you should help everybody, you should tolerate everybody? So what I see is very clear. The Old Testament God is a God of intolerance, and the God that Jesus portrayed, including Jesus' own actions, is a God of tolerance and inclusivity. Okay, so I know I've already lost any Christian who would watch this, and they've already started coming up with arguments against it. So let me try and address the topic of homosexuality. I have been doing conferences and seminars since 2002, and I have in that time had a lot of people who came, and many of them have been homosexuals. But for me, a person's sexuality is not an issue. I mean, I don't look at people that, first of all, I don't even consider whether they're gay or not unless they tell me. But because for me, people are people, and I seek to help people with their psychology. But if they're homosexuals, I don't look at it that, oh, this is wrong, you should overcome it. My main focus is to help people resolve their psychology, not these particular outer things. So if we look at this from a certain perspective, first of all, I don't think homosexuality is a sin, but is it a condition that should be corrected? And quite frankly, I don't have a clear answer to that, because I think it's very individual. But what I will say is that I'm, of course, a spiritual person. I have a spiritual view of life. And as a result of my spiritual view, I am absolutely convinced that reincarnation is a reality. In other words, we have lived for many lifetimes before this one. And why that's important to me is that it can explain a lot about what kind of psychology we have in this lifetime. And the other aspect of me being a spiritual person is that as I've said in many of my videos, the essence of spiritual growth is actually the resolution of psychology. So based on this, as I said, for me, people's sexuality is not an issue. Psychology is an issue. But is homosexuality something that should be overcome? Well, I think it's a very individual thing, and here's what I'll say about it. I think I'll talk about it in 3 different levels. So the first thing is, when you accept reincarnation, you can see that, contrary to what most people believe, we change sex between different embodiments. We're not always in a male body or in a female body. Many people who have believe they know their past lifetimes, they will often, if they're in a male body in this lifetime, they will only see past lifetimes as a male or a female, respectively. So, but there are, of course, people who see that they have been in both male and female bodies. So let's say, just theoretical example here, let's say somebody has been in a male body for several lifetimes. And as a result of that, they have come to identify very much with being a man and being sexually attracted to women. But now, for the first time, after several embodiments as a man in a male body, they embody in a female body. But if they can't quite make the switch. They can still carry over something from those several lifetimes in a male body, a sexual attraction to women, for example, or certain masculine traits. So to me, this could be part of the explanation why you see some women who have a more masculine manner and are attracted to women sexually. And of course the same for men, having a more female manner and being attracted to men sexually. It could be. I'm not saying it is for everybody, but it could be. So I think if that is the case, I think it's possible that you could work on some psychological aspects and come to a point where you make a switch and you realize, okay, regardless of what I did in past lifetimes, I'm now in a male body, so I accept that. I accept that sexuality. But I'm not saying this necessarily should happen, and certainly not for everybody. So, but I think that would be possible. But it would require you to work on pretty deeply in the psychology, because my experience working with psychology is that for many people, your sense of being a man or woman is very deeply ingrained in what I call the identity level of the mind. So you would have to really go deep and discover this, so that basically you can overcome the identification of being a man or woman. Because again, I'm a spiritual person, and the way I look at it is, we are not created as men or women. We are created as androgynous beings. I talk about how we have the outer personality, and then the core of our being is what I call the conscious you, which is neutral or pure awareness. So the conscious you is not male or female. We also have a spiritual self in the spiritual realm. The spiritual self is not male or female. It's androgynous. And so the conscious you is sent into embodiment by the spiritual self. And of course, you have to take embodiment in a male or female body. So therefore, you take on that sense of identity so you can actually function in a male or female body. But obviously what we see in the modern age is that after all these thousands of years where men's roles and women's roles were very strictly defined, this is beginning to soften up. And it's changing. And you see some nations, of course, where they're completely close to this and they want to maintain traditional values where women are put down and are the slaves of men and men are the superior ones. But we see in most modern democracies how this is changing, completely changing, and there's a clear movement towards equality between the sexes. Of course, Christians have a very big problem with that because, again, they're reading the Old Testament. And who was it that ate the forbidden fruit? Oh yeah, it was Eve. So all women are guilty of pulling men into sin. That is what many Christians in America, in my view, believe, and that's why you see that in these homophobic environments there's also a discrimination against women. It's not nearly as openly expressed, but it's clearly there. I mean, clearly and obviously there. And I have met it in many Christians and several Christian communities in the United States. So, so what I'm saying is that obviously we are in the democratic nations moving towards greater and greater tolerance related to men and women and their relationship. There are many different kinds of relationships. So this could just be one way to look at the psychology involved with homosexuality. And I think there are some people that probably, if they were willing to do this work and work on their identification with a physical body or with their sexuality, perhaps it's possible I think it's possible they could resolve something and make peace with the sexuality of the body they are in. But I don't think this applies to all homosexuals, and I don't think it's something that necessarily should be done. It's an individual choice. But you could also see that just as you have, like say, you've been a man in a male body for several lifetimes, you could have people who have been homosexuals for several lifetimes. And then it's much more deeply in their sense of identity. But I would still say that again, as a spiritual person, my entire outlook on life is that Earth is an educational institution. And we are here to have various experiences until we've had enough of them. And this means that we can go into many different experiences. And as I said, the conscious you is a neutral being. But in order to have a particular experience, it goes into a sense of identity, identifying itself as in a certain way. And one of the experiences you can have on Earth is being a homosexual. And it's for me, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just like having the experience of being a heterosexual. The heterosexual identity is just more common. But it's just an experience you can have. So you can have people who desire that experience and have had it for several lifetimes and hadn't had enough of it. Then it will require, I think, a different approach. And I'm not saying that necessarily even should overcome it. What if you haven't had enough of it and you want to have additional lifetimes after this one? Then it shouldn't be overcome. You just, in my view, you should make peace with your sexuality and practice it in a manner that doesn't harm yourself and others, and so what's the big deal? But again, in the long run, I think that, as I said, we're meant to have any experience we want to have on Earth until we've had enough of it. And the question is, if there comes a point where you've had enough of the kind of experiences you have on Earth, then you start disidentifying yourself from these experiences. So this would include that you come to a point where you disidentify yourself from sexuality, whether you're heterosexual or homosexual. There comes a point where you're not identifying yourself based on your sexuality. And you may still be sexually active, but it steps in the background. It doesn't dominate your life. But then I want to talk about another aspect of this, is that, as I said in the very beginning, we are clearly, when you step back and look at the world and look at the movement in the world, we are moving towards a point where there's greater tolerance. You could argue that Jesus came to inaugurate an age of greater tolerance than what you see in Old Testament times. And this has many aspects, but just one aspect is, let's say you are a homosexual and you were born in a Christian, very homophobic environment. I have met several people who came to my conferences who grew up in a very homophobic environment, and they are homosexuals. And if you accept reincarnation, you also have the idea that before you come into this embodiment, you meet with your spiritual teachers and you're formulating a life plan. What is it you want to do in this lifetime? And my sense of it is that there are quite a few people who have chosen to embody as homosexuals in these very homophobic environments. Not necessarily only in the United States. There are several other countries, including some Catholic countries, that are very homophobic. But they have done this not to increase, not specifically focused on homosexuality, not specifically to increase tolerance towards homosexuals. They've done it to increase tolerance in general, because for them, the homosexuality is just something they've taken on because this is obviously a big topic in some communities. And so this is a way to sort of provoke the self-righteous people of the community and show them the need to develop tolerance. I mean, I look at this, I look at the little bit I know about this sexual conversion therapy movement in the United States, and I can see that there are at least some people who are beginning to realize that this isn't a black and white issue. There are some people who have gone through this conversion theory and denied their sexuality, and now they have gone back to openly acknowledging their homosexuality. I just think that they haven't quite stepped up to realizing that it isn't really about homosexuality, it's about tolerance and overcoming the intolerance that is so rampant in many of these Christian communities. As I said, if you read the Old Testament, if you read what Jesus said and what he did, you can't fail to see a fundamental difference. I mean, the angry and condemning God that is turning Lot's wife into a pillar of salt and destroying 2 cities. And then Jesus saying, fear not, little flock, it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Forgive 70 times 7, do good to those that hate you, do unto others. How can you not see that there's a fundamental difference? The God of the Old Testament is completely intolerant of anybody who doesn't do what he says. I mean, he literally is a tyrant. The God of the Old Testament, narcissistic personality disorder, on black and white on the page. Jesus' God, completely different. Jesus' God wants everybody to come into his kingdom. The Old Testament God wants only a few self-righteous people to enter his kingdom. How do you fail to see this? So I just think that for many of these people who are homosexuals and who have grown up in a Christian community, it isn't just about the homosexuality. It's really about reforming Christianity to become a more inclusive and tolerant religion. And you obviously see that there are those who are the, what you might call it, fundamentalist Christians, who are doing everything they can to oppose this. For example, in the United States, where you have people who are saying, oh, this thing about forgive 70 times 7 and do good to those that hate you, that's just weak. That's just the old way. So basically, they haven't seen that Jesus completely stepped up from the Old Testament God and presented a new view of God. And they think we should hold on to traditional values, which is basically intolerance. Complete intolerance to anybody who's different. Because they believe God is intolerant. But that's not the God that Jesus talked about. So wake up here. And I'm just saying, I think that there are people who have reached a high level of spiritual maturity. And they're not really identified with their sexuality. And before they came into this lifetime, they were looking at how can I make a contribution to improving society. And they were seeing the need to promote greater tolerance. And they were saying, well, how can I best promote greater tolerance? Well, I go into the most intolerant environments. And then I make myself a subject or a target of people's intolerance, and then I seek to reform it from there by showing them that I'm actually a human being, instead of, because most people think, those that are different are not human beings like themselves. That's a typical reaction. And so, so I just think that many homosexuality isn't the primary issue here. And I see some homosexuals that get trapped in what I would call it evangelical homosexuality instead of evangelical Christianity. And that's why the two often clash, of course. And they are so focused on the homosexual issue, but I think the larger issue here is tolerance. Are we going to move towards a more tolerant society or a more intolerant? Are we going to go backwards and become more intolerant? And I think it's especially an issue in these years, obviously in the United States, where I think anybody who looks at it can see that America is moving towards greater intolerance. Let's kick all the aliens out. Let's suppress this and suppress that. So the question really is, for America, is America becoming more tolerant or less tolerant? And the greater issue there is America going to continue to be a democracy, or is it going to regress? Because a democracy is based on tolerance. In fact, a democracy is based on Jesus's do unto others, do good to those that hate you, forgive 70 times 7. Those kind of values in the Sermon on the Mount, that's what a democracy is based on. And so if you have a large number of people who claim to be Christians in the United States who think this is weak, this is the old way, then we are moving away from democracy. I mean, seriously, do these Christians in the United States want to turn the United States into a caliphate where instead of the Muslim priests, it's the Christian priests who are running the show? Do they want a Christian version of the Sharia law? Is that what they're envisioning? I'm just letting the question hang there. And so, so I think, well, one thing, other thing I would consider here in this. As a spiritual person, it's my view that the world is created by two forces. There is an expanding force and a contracting force. And you see the scientific theory of the Big Bang. The idea was all matter, all energy was compressed into a singularity, then there was the Big Bang and everything expanded from there. But if there was only an expansive force, why wouldn't the explosion just continue to go out? Why would structures form, such as planets and solar systems and galaxies? So in other words, there is an expansive force that drives the expansion of the universe, but there's also a contracting force that balances it. And it's the balance between the two that determines what kind of forms we have. So I think this has many layers, of course, and without going too much into all of this, I think at the human level, we have two forces in our psychology. I mean, we have many, but we have two basic forces, the expansive force and the contracting force. And you can, although it's not a complete view, but you can see them as masculine and feminine. So as I said, we are not inherently men and women. But when it comes to expressing ourselves, we are using these two forces, an expansive force and a contracting force. And quite frankly, this has many ramifications. I mean, you could say that the essence of what kind of a life we have is the balance between the two. And the balance between the two is actually provided by what I call the Christ mind or the one mind. And that is what balances the two. So that, because if they become unbalanced, it leads to self-destruction. In other words, if the expansive force becomes too strong, everything will be blown apart in an explosion. And if the contracting force becomes too strong, everything contracts into a black hole. So there's two ways of destruction: too much expansion, too much contraction, and there has to be a balance. And that is the Christ mind. And that's, in my view, why Jesus preached tolerance. He was really not preaching tolerance, but balance. Balance between the two forces. And so what do you see in the world? You see that the Old Testament God is clearly the unbalanced masculine force, the angry male figure in the sky, condemning and sending to hell those who don't do his bidding. And Jesus therefore preached a more balanced God, which is essentially a more feminine God. Because what do you see in Old Testament times? Because of Genesis, because of the story of Adam and Eve, women have been put down in many societies for thousands of years. And that means these societies are unbalanced. They have an unhealthy balance between the masculine and feminine. And they are going to self-destruct. It's inevitable. So the only way to create a sustainable society is to have a better balance between the expansive and contracting forces, the masculine and feminine. And what is needed to have a better balance is the Christ mind, the Christ perspective. And what does the Christ mind see? Oneness between the Creator and His creation. That's why there can be balance, because when you take the unbalanced masculine perspective, you think only the masculine force is important and the feminine force is weak and should be suppressed. When you take an unbalanced feminine perspective, you think the same thing. I mean, the opposite thing, that the masculine should be suppressed and the feminine should be dominant. And the Christ mind sees the need for a balance between the two. And this is what Christians haven't grasped. So what I'm trying to say with all of this is that I think you could say that the real issue here is not really people's sexuality, whether they are homosexuals or heterosexuals. The real issue is, do we have a healthy balance between the expanding and contracting forces, masculine and feminine? And we all have masculine and feminine forces. And there is, and what creates imbalance is that we suppress one and enhance the other, blow up the other. So this actually leads me back to something else I wanted to say, which is the whole idea that you can pray the gay away by, and what I see in some of these people who have gone through this conversion therapy, and they felt they had overcome their sexuality, but they hadn't really, and now they have switched into realizing this was actually harmful because they just suppressed their sexuality. And as a spiritual person, I'm very clear that you absolutely gain nothing from suppressing any aspect of your psychology. You have to openly acknowledge it, have to openly look at it. But you can then start working on resolving any imbalances in your psychology. And perhaps that changes your sexuality, perhaps it doesn't. But if you work on resolving psychology, whether your sexuality changes doesn't matter, because to me it is, can you live with it in a balanced way where you feel at peace with your sexuality, whatever it is? I mean, as a spiritual person, my goal is, the people who come to me, my goal is to help them feel at peace. Not be this or be that, or suppress this or suppress that. You don't get inner peace by suppressing anything. It will always come out and haunt you later. So I don't know. I know there are so many things that could be said about this topic. I also know that I'm not really an expert on it, because obviously I didn't grow up in a homophobic environment, and I didn't grow up in a Christian environment, and I'm not a homosexual and don't have any leanings that way. So perhaps I'm being insensitive here, but then people can comment on it, or they can ask me further questions, and I'll see if I have anything meaningful to say about it.